Chancellor Sri N. Vora, Vice Chancellor Professor Khurshid Andrabi, Director of the Institute, Professor Gul Muhammad Wani, distinguished faculty members, deans of schools, heads of departments, and all the more, the students of this university and this institute. I am particularly happy to speak here because this institute is one of the few places where students from different parts of South Asian countries can come and study. We don't have many institutes of this kind in India. Maybe I can think of the Sark University in Delhi and the upcoming Ashoka University in Bihar. So we don't have many places where students from this region can sit together, think about the problems of their own states and societies, and also see the regional problems together. I'm also doubly happy to be here because this is first time I am visiting Kashmir, and I am stunned by the view here, the trees, the Dal Lake, the mountains, and it's such a stunning view that I'm having. I'm enjoying this from the last evening, looking from the guest house and walking around the Dal Lake. So the imagination I have had about Kashmir from my childhood is somehow I'm trying to, that's sinking in, although we hear so many things about Kashmir these days. So today I propose to speak on a theme called the changing meanings of development and welfare in Indian politics. Why I chose this? Because this is the biggest challenge that most countries of the world face today for a very long time, whether it's Europe or even advanced countries, the developed countries like United States or Scandinavia, considered to be model of welfare and development for a very long time, the Scandinavian model, or even the continent, the European continent. This problem is coming up, whether development comes first and welfare next, or whether welfare comes first and development next, or whether they can be harnessed in such a way that they can go together. Especially this debate has become more pertinent and vigorous after the collapse of socialist states in East Europe and Soviet Union, and with the globalization process that's going on, even in countries like Scandinavia, where the welfare expenditure has been coming down, and new ideas of how to live with this kind of a situation where you have to give greater encouragement and incentives to industry, businesses in order to achieve economic growth would involve a low quantity of welfare. And there are scholars who have worked on this, who have criticized this. This debate is going on. There were scholars who talked of third way, even as an alternative to social democracy, that has been put in place in countries like Scandinavia, Germany, Belgium, Netherlands, etc. But this problem becomes all the more critical to developing nations, whether it is Bangladesh or Pakistan or India or Nepal. I'm only taking India as a context to understand this debate, because this debate has acquired importance in recent decades, and we know what's happening to some extent in India so closely. Now, look at the term development. It's a very simple term. Everybody wants to develop. Develop is to progress, to go to a better situation than what we are in. And most of us aspire to develop further, to move forward, to reach higher levels. In that sense, development is something, a basic intrinsic human aspiration everywhere, at even individual level, a collective level, group level, or at the national level. Welfare is also a very simple term. Welfare is a kind of a good living, that where we are not afraid of things, where we are secure, where our common basic needs are met, like food, shelter, clothing, security, some dignity, our health problems, they are met. And then we all live together happily to lead a kind of a happy life. This is also basic human aspiration, that we look for a good life. But words have different meanings in different contexts, in different places, and in different times. As times change, the meanings of words also change. It depends on what these words signify to different people at different points of time. The etymological meanings, or the meanings that are derived from certain words, could be different from what they signify, or the meanings that get settled when we speak those words or terms or concepts. To just give you a background, development, the word came into existence after the Second World War, as we understand today, that some are not so developed as others are in this world. So some are developed countries, some are not so developed countries. They can be backward countries, or backward people, or undeveloped people, or underdeveloped people. There is so much debate on the meanings of these three words: the backward, the undeveloped, and underdeveloped. Now, I will take two words, the undeveloped and underdeveloped. Undeveloped means that you are at a stage before what others are now, in the sense that some are developed, you are not that now, you are undeveloped. So developed and undeveloped people can coexist. Some can be developed and some can be undeveloped. Underdeveloped is different. Underdevelopment is a result of development of some and lack of development for others. Because some people have not developed, others have developed. So some have become rich because many have become poor. It's not that some are poor and some are rich. The poor are poor because rich are rich. It's the rich which made the poor poor. This is the meaning of underdevelopment. There are many scholars who wrote books and theories and theses on underdevelopment. So there are two theories. One is theories of underdevelopment, theories of undevelopment. And in between there is one more theory called uneven development. Uneven development is everybody develops, all develop, but some develop more than others. That my income also increases, my education also improves, but it doesn't improve as much as your education and your income improves. So there is unevenness or inequality between people who are developing. So the word developing, some people considered it as euphemism for either undeveloped or unevenly developed or underdeveloped people of the world. This development gained a kind of valency after the Second World War, especially this got great encouragement from the United States. So there is a specialization called development studies, and institutes of development have been set up all over the world, not only in India, all over the world. And development studies have become a huge academic, scholarly enterprise. What this development meant, what are these development studies? This assumed that there are stages in development that people move from one stage to the other. So people are backward or primitive to begin with, and then they move to agriculture, then they move to manufacture, then they move to kind of a takeoff, and then there is a stage of abundance, stage of prosperity, where everybody can share happily and live happily. So a nation has to pass through these stages, the way European nations have passed through these stages of primitive societies, of slavery, feudalism, capitalism, and then abundance. Of course, Marx talked of communism, but then development studies stop at that stage of abundance. So the Western scholarship and Western policymakers told us that you are at a stage of undevelopment, and then you have to move to the stage of prosperity, and the model you have is the Western model, the European model of capitalist development, where industries have to be set up, societies have to be transformed from agrarian feudal societies to capitalist societies, and then mass production of commodities has to take place, and then the mass consumption happens because everybody can now have things to consume. So this was the model that was prescribed at the time of our independence, considered to be valid model. But then there was also a competing model at the time when India became independent, that of socialism. But the socialist model believed that development is development if only it provides a good life to the workers and peasants, to the suffering classes. So when the suffering classes or the proletariat and peasantry, they come together and they own the means of production, that is, the state becomes the owner of capital and businesses and produce, and state plans everything in a centralized planning system, and state is responsible for production and distribution of goods in such a way that everybody will have a share in that. Okay? So there is a model socialism where the means of production are controlled by the state, and also the development is planned by the state and executed by the state. Here is another model, the model that was followed in Europe and in the United States, which was prescribed or which was thought to be a model for the rest of the developing nations, where we have a free market and free enterprise. And India chose neither a capitalist mode nor a socialist mode, what we call a mixed economy. That we thought that some industries have to be in the control of public sector, of the state, what we call public sector, yet the private initiative has to be kept, has to be encouraged. So India chose a kind of a curious combination of socialism and capitalism. Call it democratic socialism. Some people call it state socialism. And this mixed economy is based on two things. One is the state is responsible for organizing production, for controlling the basic means of production, and also allocating state resources to different fields of activity. That means that state is assumed to have two roles. One is that it must encourage development, as we understand in the West, that is growth of industry, etc. And also you should take care of the needs of the people, that it cannot ignore the needs of the suffering masses. And this was the context because why this happened. I'm not saying that this is because of the great wisdom of the rulers, but because of the very context in which India achieved its independence. India was under colonial rule for a very long time. It could not adopt the model of development that was practiced by the imperial countries. because it just came out of imperialism. It cannot go towards socialism because socialism, by that time, it was clear that individual freedoms were getting curbed there. So you wanted freedom that is available in what we call bourgeois democracies or capitalist democracies, freedom for individual and freedom for enterprise. And India also wanted to have a kind of welfare that was available or at least advocated in the socialist countries. And it was a time, if we those of historians would tell us, that 1940s, 30s, 40s, even 20s, 1920s, 30s, 40s was the time when Europe was moving towards social democracy. The social democratic parties were becoming important, and they were coming to power after Second World War. So India adopted that kind of a social democratic model of development and welfare, and that's the reason why in 1950s and 60s, although the emphasis was on self-sufficiency, on increasing production, on industrialization, on developing science and technology in the country, the state also emphasized on the need for welfare. So you have the directive principles of state policy, which essentially spoke of welfare, and you have also fundamental rights, where the freedoms are asserted and promised by the Constitution itself. And India is one such country where you have a fine combination of fundamental rights and directives to the state. Directives to the state policies like socialism, what the state must do. The way the director of the institute was, the chairman was saying that he was telling me to function like this. So Indian state was told what are the guiding principles, and many of them are welfare principles of the workers, peasants, women, children, etc., of equal wages. And fundamental rights you have where property principle was there. Afterwards it was deleted. But one of the main articles in the fundamental rights was right to property. That was sacrosanct. And in the first 2 decades after independence, India moved in that direction. Feudalism was more or less abolished. Of course, there were people's movements. Even in Kashmir, you had a movement against the feudal control of land. These movements were there in most of the states in India. So because of anti-feudal agrarian movements, because of the vision of the leadership to usher in a kind of modern relationship, abolition of intermediaries, abolition of zamindari, zagirdari systems happened all over India. Land rights were given to cultivators. Science and technology institutes were set up. New industries were brought. Electricity, cement, iron ore, these industries were set up. At the same time, there was a concern that this should also benefit the common people, because there were also left movements which were strong in India. India is one nation in the world where communist movement has been very strong even today. I think India has the strongest communist movement in the world today in democracies. I'm not talking of Cuba, I'm not talking of North Korea, I'm not talking of China. Outside that, in democracies, India has the strongest communist movement even today. So there were pressures for welfare, but for the first 2 decades we understood the word development slightly differently. We thought development was about building the nation state. We thought development was building a centralized state, because the state itself was created in 1947, amalgamation of so many princely states. The British India had to come together and a new state had to be created and a new government had to function here in a democracy. We thought that development was to industrialize the nation. Development, we thought, was to at least address the problems of the poor and the working classes. So development has a kind of a multifaceted meanings in those days. But Rajni Kothari, the professor who founded the CSDS, he said that India is one nation which faced, unlike other European nations, the challenge of simultaneous change. That Europe went through stages. Today they may say that we are all democratic, but they were absolute states for a long time. They were monarchies, and franchise were extremely limited in Europe till they got industrialized. Workers were given rights in Western Europe only in 1880s and 1890s. Till in 1890s, the workers did not have a right to vote. Only 5 to 10% adults, male adults, had the right to vote. Female women did not have the vote to the vote. Workers did not have. Peasants did not have. They became democracies only recently. Britain gave universal adult franchise to women voting in 1921. Between 1890 and 1921, democracy was introduced in these countries. By the time democracy was introduced, that is by 1890s, by the turn of 20th century, most countries of Europe, the present advanced democracies or developed nations, were highly industrialized. They became prosperous. Only after prosperity, democracy came there. But in India, it did not happen. India became democratic fully, in the sense that every citizen, adult citizen, had a right to vote, right to participate in politics. But there was hardly an industry. Because of colonial rule, there was hardly an industry except railways. There was hardly any industrial development. The science institutes only began in 1920s in India. Till 1920s, the British did not see it fit to start science institutes in India. So there was hardly any science technology in the country. There was hardly any industry in this country. And suddenly we were asked, we took upon the challenge to develop, politically, economically, and also socially. The huge diversity that India has, you have to build a nation out of this. Now, coming to 1970s, what happened? By 1970s, there was a realization that economy was not growing as it was expected to grow. What is known as, some people call it Hindu rate of growth. Very 3%, 2.8, 2.7, 3.2%, etc. annually, an average of 3%. But the aspirations of people were increasing geometrically because of democracy. Because people were participating in politics, people were demanding from government that their basic needs must be met. The Nehruvian model, which presumed that with economic growth and development, the benefits would go to the common people, to the poorer sections of society, did not fully happen because of limited economic growth, but greater participation in politics. In fact, as students of politics in the 1970s, we grew up with this literature on political development. And many of the lessons we were taught, the books we read as a student in my master's program, said that the basic problem in developing nations, some of the names, some of you, I don't know whether this students in Kashmir University are familiar with these theories of political development and underdevelopment, like Lucian Pye, Gabriel Almond, Sidney Verba, Huntington, all these people. They said that there is a big problem in these developing nations between the demand on the system and the capacity of the system. That the people's demands are growing on the system, but the system doesn't have a capacity to meet this demand, and there is a mismatch between demand and supply. And this can be broken in two ways, they suggested. Either India should become authoritarian to suppress this participation of people, these aspirations of people, for the time being, the way it is done in Malaysia, Indonesia, etc., Singapore, etc., and increase wealth, then open up, democratize. That was the medicine that was prescribed to the ills of Indian politics or polity those days. But you cannot really do away with democracy. There was an attempt in 1975 to curtail freedoms, what we call emergency. There was some attempt to curb the opposition activity, the people's movements, but then by 1977, the party that imposed emergency was utterly defeated. Mrs. Gandhi was defeated. And so now, by 1977, it was clear that you cannot really, authoritarian solution is not available to India. Maybe because it's too large, maybe it's people are more politically enlightened. That kind of emergency rule or semi-authoritarian rule is no solution, is not an option that is available. So what happened in the 1970s and 1980s was that governments and political parties started promising welfare on a massive scale. Mrs. Gandhi herself started saying that she started in the 1970s, early 70s itself by radicalizing Congress. There were two factions in the Congress. One was headed by Mrs. Gandhi and others were more of conservatives who were saying that we should first give priority to development, Morarji Desai and others, who said that no, socialism is not good for the country, we should encourage market economy. So there was a struggle, and the radical Congress, that is Congress R, which was headed by Mrs. Gandhi, came out, split the Congress, and Congress, which later became the real Congress. So in 1970s and 80s, we saw what many political scientists call populism. Now this word populism itself is somewhat mysterious. What is the meaning of populism? Many people now call everybody populist. Some people say we will supply rice for 2 rupees a kilo, some will say it is for 1 rupee, and in Tamil Nadu now it is free. Electricity, some people say it should be, meters should be installed, some people say there should be differential slabs, and in some states it's completely free. Say in Andhra Pradesh and Telangana, where I come from, electricity is for agriculture, it is completely free. So populism is understood as making promises which you cannot fulfill, or making promises in such a way that hamper development, that you cannot really pursue economic growth along with implementation of the promises you make in order to gain votes. This is a criticism made by scholars, but the politician is there among the people. He cannot go by this scholarly advice because the politician has to get votes. He has to win election every 4 years or 5 years. And he has to satisfy people that he has done something for the people, or he will do something for the people, for common people. So welfare promises, I would call them a kind of welfare populism. I don't call it just populism, but I would call it welfare populism. And this welfare populism has grown in all states and at the national level too, by the time of V.P. Singh and others, at the central level. Now came the third stage. Now, 1980s, we saw a crisis in socialist states, starting with Poland, and soon spread to the rest of socialist camp very quickly. And one state after the other, in East Europe and Soviet Union, they fell, they collapsed. In a matter of 2-3 years, between 1988 and 1990, with Poland they fell like pack of cards. Romania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, and then finally, you know, the mother of all socialist countries, the Soviet Union, collapsed. It was a shock to most of the critics of socialism. Of course, it was certainly a situation of despair for socialists, but even it was a shock for the critics of socialism that they didn't expect that socialism would fall in such a speedy manner. And that, I think, brought a huge turn in the discourses on development and welfare. Now, the argument has come up that there is no alternative to capitalism, that the socialist ideology has come to an end. The socialist ideology that has contested the premises of capitalist ideology had come to an end. It is the end of history, what Fukuyama famously called. That what did he mean by end of history? That the alternative vision of development and welfare doesn't exist anymore. So the history as understood by Marxists as history of struggle between rich and the poor has come to an end, which Hegel originally understood as end of history, that the clash between ideas, the thesis and antithesis, that has come to an end. That's the Fukuyama's thesis. Some people call it end of ideology. So with the end of ideology and end of history theories pervading all over the world, it is now argued that development has to come first. You cannot have welfare. The state cannot simply meet these promises or spend its scarce resources on welfare schemes by not generating sufficient wealth. Sufficient wealth has to be generated in order to have that kind of a distribution. A distribution presupposes the availability of wealth. So that was a situation in which collapse of socialism and the world model of development coming back in the name of globalization. Now free markets not only internally, domestically, but free markets all over the world. That capital now must be allowed to travel between countries regardless of the borders. That borders must be open and national economies must be integrated in the international economy in such a way that goods and capital can flow freely. And that's the only way developing countries can develop. Once I attended the meeting of Prime Minister P. V. Narasimha Rao. He said a beautiful thing. He said, many of you think that I introduced economic reforms in India in 1991 because of these debates about ideas and ideologies. He said, no. I did this because of practical difficulty, because we were so dependent on socialist countries so far for our trade, for our aid. Now the socialist countries disappeared, and I had to turn to the West. And the Western countries asked me to do this. I have no other way to go. I opened the door. So whatever the circumstances that compelled the Indian state, I should say now, not just the P. V. Narasimha Rao government, that made it to embark upon the economic reform policies in 1921, two things happened. One is that now the argument is that, look, we so far thought that development and welfare must be the twin goals of the state. And now we have a situation where development must be the concern of the market. You must leave it to the market, the demand and supply forces. And welfare must be left to the civil society. So if you want to understand the new model where you have the state, the market, and civil society, state is not the only actor in achieving development and welfare, but then you have the markets and the civil society, the third domain, playing an equally important role in this process. And state now must be only a facilitator in this process or regulator at the best of the market, so that the animal instincts of industrial classes or business people do not unleash themselves in the society. So you regulate it. And then you are a facilitator for the economic growth. So state is not a provider, state is not a supplier, a source of economic growth, but state is a facilitator of economic growth. State is not a provider of welfare, but state is only a facilitator of welfare, which must happen either through the market, that is, industry is going for corporate social responsibility activities, or the civil society coming in and either you form associations and then build the social capital, user associations, children parents associations for schools, or several other NGO civil society activity. You can actually deliver welfare. So welfare, it is not just possible for the state to deliver. The old arguments of not Adam Smith, but Ludwig Mises came back. Or Hayek, who argued those days, Friedrich Hayek, Ludwig Mises, these people argued that you cannot just plan, because there are millions of people whose requirements are different, whose thinking is different, whose needs are different. You sitting in one center cannot really deliver to the needs of people. Now, in the last stage, the politicians realized, more than anybody else, that they cannot really separate these functions. They cannot merely preside over a state which is facilitator, not a provider. Because economic reforms, the benefits, people have seen that they are not reaching them. The rosy imagination of economic reforms, the results of which are not reaching. Then people said, no, it will take time for industries to develop, economy to develop, wait. But then politicians cannot wait because they have to face an election. So all the elections between 1994, the first election of economic reforms was fought in 1994 at state level, till recently, till 2014, the debate has been on development and welfare. How these words are presented, how these concepts are articulated, may be different from election to election, from politician to politician, from political party to political party. But with elections taking place every 5 years, and in India elections happen, not just every 5 years, almost every year, because you have municipal, local body election, then you have provincial election, then you have parliament election coming. So elections happen every 1.5 to 2 years. So there is a pressure on politicians. And the politicians now began to win elections not only through welfare promises but also through two different means. In fact, Varaji has written that report in 1993 on corruption, criminality and politics. It is an excellent report. Those of you who have not read that report, please, it is available on the web. Yesterday I was actually looking at the web, and the report, text of that report is available. Probably you were Home Secretary at that time, and it was one of the excellent reports I have read. Now, what happened around those 1990s and later. One is you make empty promises, or you provide certain sops to people temporarily at the time of election. Between elections, you talk about development, and at the time of elections, you talk about welfare. And then for this, you need huge funds. In several states, votes are purchased. There is I don't know what is happening in Kashmir, but in many states in the south and in Maharashtra, voters are paid nowadays about 1,500, 2,000, 2,500, 3,000 rupees, depending on the situation, depending on the nature of political competition, candidates, etc. The greater the competition, the greater the price or bribe for the voter. And the amount of money that is spent on liquor and the other paraphernalia that politicians will have is simply huge. And so the politician has to generate huge amounts of funds. You just tell me when I have to stop. I will take another 5 minutes. I will wind up in another 5 minutes. So, and on the other side, what we got is a kind of, not real capitalism, but kind of a crony capitalism, which Prime Minister Manmohan Singh himself talked about. That he said, what is developing in India is not capitalism, but a kind of crony capitalism. That we have seen what happened with the 2G spectrum, with the mining, the kind of scandals, that huge contracts were given away to businessmen who lobby with the politician and who would offer huge amounts of money or other benefits to politicians, either to the politician personally or to the party. But what happens once you start getting money? You cannot draw a line between, it's difficult, you see. What is party's money and what is my money? And with so much money accumulating with the parties now need thousands of crores of money. That is, they handle with thousands of crores of money. The candidates spend huge amounts of money. I'm told that today in many states, the average expenditure for a parliamentary constituency is about 50 crore rupees. So imagine a candidate spending 50 crores rupees. How much money you should have in order to just spend a minimum of 50,000 crores rupees. Exceptions are there. There are some very good candidates who spend very little. So you have rich people now becoming candidates. You have all industrialists, business people, contractors, or retired IAS officers who have amassed wealth, or revenue officers, income tax officers. These are the people, or who have this kind of, who run private colleges, private universities, who make huge money, because they have the money now. And if you look at the profiles of these MLAs, MPs, many of them have such a background, because they need to spend a lot of money. Parties need to spend a lot of money. That's why the party leaders bring their own kith and kin into the party. Daughters, sons, sons-in-law, they have to rule the country because the huge amounts of money is there. So somebody trusted person has to be there. If your son eats it away, it's okay. But if outsider eats it, is a problem. So you have to bring your son or daughter or son-in-law, daughter-in-law, somebody very close to you in order to administer these huge amounts of wealth that is with the party. So you have high levels of political corruption, high levels of clientelism, what we call clientelism these days. Clientelism is where you offer individual benefits in order to get political support, either to business people or industrialists or voters. The levels may vary. With an industrialist, it is 1,000 crore offer or 100 crore offer with a contractor. With a voter, it is 3,000 rupees. So you have to have clients. You reduce citizens to clients. The whole idea of citizen participation and citizen empowerment is undermined, and citizens become clients, and politicians become extremely corrupt, and then an excess of bureaucrats, politicians, and business people builds. We have seen the Nera Radio tapes, where the business people tell the politician who should be the minister where. So you have such a unholy nexus of politician, top bureaucrat, and business people. Business people who want to make money not through producing goods and commodities and selling them in the market, but making money by political leveraging. So you have such a vicious situation that has developed in the last 10, 15 years after economic reforms. Economic reforms, instead of heralding an era of unbridled economic growth, actually have unleashed an era of high political corruption and crony capitalism. So I think, in the end, and this was in a way debated in 2014 election, and both parties, both the BJP and the Indian National Congress, BJP had stressed more on development, called it Vikas. Narendra Modi as the prime ministerial candidate, he said it is Vikas. He made no offer, no promise of welfare, except a kind of general saying that India should grow, India should become rich, India should emerge as a superpower, but could not neglect welfare. If you look at the manifesto, there are several schemes, like food security, they have continued, or unemployment guarantee scheme or employment guarantee scheme they are implementing. Congress, on the other hand, emphasized more on welfare, less on development, saying that this development is causing problems, farmer suicides, poverty, etc., etc. So eradication of poverty, unemployment, and empowerment was the slogan of the Congress. And BJP came up with the slogan of Vikas. What is that slogan? Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas. We are with everyone, we are for development. And then you have this kind of controlling inflation, eradication of corruption, and making India as the manufacturing hub in Asia, etc., etc. So two models were presented. One is development, stress on development with some welfare. Another model is stress on welfare with some development. Probably people chose between the two the first model because people were fed up with the kind of crony capitalism and corruption that increased under at least the second UPA 2. Now what I see here in conclusion is that we cannot emphasize one over the expense of the other. The development and welfare have to be understood the way they were understood at the time when India became independent. That both have to go in tandem. That to say that first we will achieve development and then redistribution is not possible in a democracy. That is possible in Singapore, that was possible in Singapore or Malaysia, or that is possible in China now, where China state government can just demolish the entire city, ask people to move to some other place and bring them back after 2 years. Or just ask people to vacate and set up industries. A government fell in West Bengal just because it acquired 600 acres of land in Singapore. Here, it's not easy to acquire 600 acres in some of the states. It's not that easy. The debate is going on land acquisition. Now Modi government has realized that how difficult it is to get a legislation like land acquisition bill passed. It is a democracy. And that is the biggest challenge of India, that you have to achieve development and welfare in a democratic political framework. You cannot resort to authoritarian framework in order to achieve first development and then welfare. Or you cannot harp upon welfare without caring for development. Welfare cannot be an apology for development. So you cannot stress exclusively on development at the cost of welfare. You cannot emphasize welfare without caring for development. And thirdly, Welfare cannot be mere sops. You just throw some incentives or some biscuits to voters in order to vote for you at the time of election. Welfare and development have to be genuine concerns of the government, whether it's at the central level or at the state level. And only a genuine concern for development and welfare, that these two goals can be achieved simultaneously. And there is no other way for India, because we are not so fortunate like Western countries where they had colonies to exploit, to transfer wealth from colonies to the imperial center, whether science and technology developed by leaps and bounds in Western Europe in 16th, 17th centuries. We don't have indigenous science and technology. We don't have so much of industrial development. We don't have the luxury of an absolute state that Germany, France, England had for 2 centuries. So here, India operates under extreme constraints of limited capital, of growing population, of a democratic political framework. So, operating in a democratic political framework, the goals of development and welfare have to be pursued simultaneously, and the concern of the political class has to be genuine, and this must be clear to the people that the true representatives can be elected, and a good governance is possible in contemporary times. Thank you very much.